Good afternoon, everybody. It's Travis Weller. Thanks again for joining me for the 2-Minute Clinic. I've got a great group of guests here and gentlemen that I admire in the band world that are doing a lot of great things and just giving them an opportunity to share with you. And we're focusing really today on the warm-up and what all that involves. And joining me is Andy Yozviak from Westchester University and Tad Greig from Westminster College, and Jason Worzbyt from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And the one thing that I want to start with, and Andy, I'll let you lead on this, is warm-ups are part of our rehearsal routine, but how do we keep them from being a routine where everybody's checking out before we actually get to what we need to get to?
Yeah, I guess that's it's definitely a trap that many of us can and sometimes do fall into. But I guess probably one of the easiest things we could do is focusing something different each time we start, even if we're going to use a similar kind of exercise. You know, maybe the warm-up process starts with a long tone Remington exercise or something like that, just to get some air through the horns. Maybe the exercise is listening through the ensemble, and we're talking about that pyramid of sound right out of the gate. So it's how are we fitting into the ensemble? Maybe the game is, all right, we're going to use that same warm up on those Remington exercises, but in the span of a whole note, subdivide eighth notes and let it be about time. You know, so it's pop, 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 maybe how we're matching articulations or something like that. I guess if you could create different focuses, that helps to just keep things fresh and at least change the focus of what the students are doing at the start of the rehearsal. Because for me, that first thing, I guess more than anything, is just about getting some air through your horn and re-engaging with your muscles and what our embouchure is and stuff like that. And a little later, I guess we get into the tone and tune part, how we're matching with others.
Tad, I know that I've seen you do some Remington and do some of those exact kind of things. Similar mindset there for you?
Yeah, I mean, Andy hits it right out of the park. I think the key thing with me is making sure, and I teach my students this about setting the environment first. So you want kids to develop a regimen of similarity. That doesn't mean that we play the same things at the same tempo, but there's an expectation of these are the things that we're going to do. And so we have the environment set up, and they have a sense of these are the things we do. And then I use initial warm-ups similar to what Dr. Yozviak said, just to get air through the horns, get the face warmed up, get the ears opened up. However, in something as simple as long tones and 5-note patterns and things that I use, there's never anything written. Now the college kids, you can go through this a little faster, but I like all these exercises to be by memory. So we can do 5-note patterns in whatever key, whatever, so that the focus is not on reading anything off the page. The focus is on developing the communication between the conductor and the ensemble. So we do long tones. How long? Well, I'll show you when to move. Or if I hold up certain fingers, play that many. So in the course of playing something that we need to do to technically warm up, they have to engage with me because I'm telling them to do certain things in the midst of their playing. And there's nothing written down, so there's nothing on that table between they and me, nothing on the stand, so we can develop a really deep connected communication. The key is, in terms of the mundane part of it, is that it can't always be the same thing. So it can always be some type of a Remington, certainly, but we can vary that like crazy. I can start, if I want to start them off, take a perfect interval, a perfect fifth. Woodwind start on this pitch, brass start on this pitch, and let's work perfect intervals a little bit. And again, move with me. So I think the key, the initial part of that rehearsal is establish environment and establish connection. And then don't allow that connection to be broken. It's other ancillary things, or if you have things that are memorized that you can do and you can connect with them because they get to see what's in your toolbox. They get to see what a forte piano looks like. They get to see what a crescendo looks like, a diminuendo looks like, any of that kind of stuff. And I think that kind of gets them to leave the mental baggage of the day at the door. You know, they just left a English test or a whatever class. We're kind of mentally putting that all away and getting them kind of ready for the rest of that warm up procedure and to get into the rehearsal. So that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Jason, just anything to add there, and if you want to even talk about just how you're focusing sound through that process, that would be great.
Well, boy, the two gentlemen that just spoke before me took all the really good bits. So I'm just gonna, I guess philosophically, you know, I was reading something by James Jordan where he says that, you know, when folks come into a rehearsal, that warm up is so important because the way that our ears process sound is so different than the way we process speech. And we spend the vast majority of our day, you know, we're listening to, they're listening to their teachers or they're having conversations. And the way that they process the syntax of speech is so different than the syntax of music, because when we're listening to music, it's multidimensional listening, because we're listening to tone quality, we're listening to balance, we're listening to intonation, we're listening to different mixtures between timbres. And so that's why I think that warm-up that warm-up period is so important, so they can kind of get into this different atmosphere and really be plugged into it, you know. So one of the things that I like to have my students do, and they rebel a little bit at the beginning of the semester, is to sing as well as play. And by doing both of those, it gets them using their voice a little bit more than maybe they would. But I have found that really helps to kind of center a pitch center, you know. So that warm up time, and my colleagues know where that time that we get with our students is so precious. I always feel like my rehearsals are always going like that, but that time that we spend, at least with the beginning with them, I just think to get them into this other world where they're processing this oral information so differently, that's why I think that warm up is so important.
Yeah, and you know, the thing that I keep coming back to, and I ask honor bands that I've done, I ask them to sing a tuning note, I ask them to sing certain things, and you know, I always get to like, well, I joined band for a reason. And listen, right. I always ask them like, who is Michelangelo, and I always preface it with, please don't say a turtle. And you know, then I talked to them about, like, when it came to the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo had the vision in his mind, and it wasn't the tool brush, or it wasn't the paintbrush that did the work. It was the inner artist that told the paintbrush what to do. And for us, we're musicians, and if our ear and our voice can recognize what it is we need to be doing through the horn, I think it comes out of the horn, you know, just a little bit easier. So. I just to let each of you talk about this one, and Andy, you had mentioned briefly about that pyramid of sound, and if each of you would just want to talk about how you maybe address that with your own groups, or how you've had to address it and perhaps modify it when you go out. And I know each of you do a lot of guest conducting, so. Yeah, Jason, if you want to start there, and then we'll jump over to the other.
Well, I think it's, you know, every situation is so different, especially when you go out on the road, because, you know, I've gone on the road where you've got like one tuba and 17 saxophones, and then you go to another group where the instrumentation is just totally different. So I will spend a lot of time, at least initially, with a group, just thinking, okay, how are we going to get this, you know, how on earth are we going to get this to work? And a lot of times that pyramid of sound is going to change depending on the repertoire that we're doing too. So so sometimes depending on music that I'll work with, you know, if I'm doing like a vocal transcription, like a Lauridsen piece, well, maybe I will go with that pyramid of sound. But if I go to something else where the instrumentation, orchestration, the sound concept is so totally different, I may go with something else. So a lot of it is just, based on the situation. A lot of times with honor bands, what I'll do, I'll actually, before I do any type of pitch or tuning, I'll actually just have them play. It's like, okay, let's get a march. Because a lot of times these kids don't know how to warm up. Some kids will be, you've seen these kids at the honor bands, they'll be playing for like 45 minutes in the auditorium, and then some kid just comes up that hasn't done anything, and they sit with a cold horn, and they just want to play. So sometimes I'll just play like a march through or something like that to get their horns warm, and then maybe I'll tune. So that way, you know, so that's just kind of a couple of things that I've done, because some kids they just don't know how to warm up. That's the other part of it too.
Ted, do you find that same? Do you find that the same when you're out, and even with your college kids, that maybe they've never been taught about like why the warm up's important and how to do that?
Yeah, exactly. We just like Jason said, you know, typically we're going to have some kind of all-engaging exercise at the beginning, something just to get everybody focused. And going back to a long tone scenario, one of the things that I do is I just let them play. And so we'll go through a 2 or 3 series of long tones, and then I'll stop, and then we'll go back, and I said, this time when we go through, I want you to listen to the person on your left and right, and I don't want you to hear you. I want you to hear the people on your left and your right. Typically, the thing that happens, first off, they play softer, but we started to engage their ear. We started to get them to understand that they're starting to think about sound and the sound that surrounds them. And I'll remind them that, you know, this XYZ Honors Band is comprised of 25 schools, and so you may have some of your bandmates in here, but it's a totally different group. So what we have to do first is we have to get our sound. It's not your sound from your high school or whatever. We have to get our sound. So here's some things that we're going to do. And it gives them, I would like to think that I don't dictate to the students. I like them to assume that they have some ownership. So I just try to provide them some guidance and some things for them to do. And we'll reflect on a little bit. So once we go back, listen to your left and to your right, I'll stop them. What did you hear? And, you know, half the band will put their hand up. But a couple of people will make an astute observation. Well, we played softer. Yes, you did. And how come? Well, we were trying to listen to, well, isn't that a great thing? If there are 5 first alto saxophones, right? So, you know, you get that listening process, but then you have to feed off of it. And I think, I know when I was younger, because I'm not now, when I started off, I had my litany of warm-up things to do. And so we did them. You know, we went through the Ed Lisk things or whatever, but then I didn't follow up. So if I'm establishing a sense of balance within ensemble or within family, I've got to, during the course of that rehearsal, know that in the repertoire, there's going to be a place I can come back and reflect on that. Say, what did we talk about? And given this, can we go back and try that again and open our ears left and right or whatever? You know, so it's just not, well, I'm throwing out concepts, but I'm not providing enough time for them to reflect on the concepts in the context of the whatever piece that we're playing. You know, and so even if the end run of the concert is so, I'm hoping, my goal is for them to take some things away that they can use and apply, you know, in the future. I've kind of gotten away from, I want this to be the most spectacular honor band in the world. I want them to do well, but I want them to leave having learned some conceptual things. So you talked about warm up, you know, whether it's patterns or whatever, but why am I using them? What is their purpose? So for the kid that doesn't study privately and really just does the scales that they do before band class, they have a sense of, I did these, they got me to listen a little bit more. Maybe when they go back to their school, they'll take those with them and hopefully benefit then the director at that school.
All right. Now, Tab, the one thing, and this was something early on when I was still at Mercer, and you came up and did a clinic with my group, and we're rehearsing them on a couple of things. And then afterwards, you spoke to me about this concept of linking your warm-up to those rehearsal objectives. And you've already sort of alluded to that in some of the comments, but if you just want to, take a couple minutes and expand upon that idea.
Oh, you bet. And I'd like to think it came to me organically, but no, I just learned it from people that know a heck of a lot more than I do. I believe that last part of the warm-up sequence. You know, we have warm-ups for the tongue, for the mind, the kinesthetics of what we do. But there's that last part where we are teaching them how to play, how to execute musical concepts, so that then the music that they're going to do in the body of the rehearsal it's just executing the concepts that they've learned. It comes from tuba players, bass clarinet players. You know, these guys that typically in the repertoire that they're going to do, they're not always going to be challenged that much. But as a music educator, don't they need to understand how these different rhythms work? Don't they need to understand how to work these asymmetrics? You know, and so taking a concept out of the music that you're working on and getting it on the board, having it somewhere where everybody can work this. Again, they may not have it in their part, but they need to understand how to do that. You know, they need to play some lines that are maybe much more technically challenging, or do some interval things that you find present in your music. We talk about in conducting class about when we're dissecting our music and what are we looking for. And for me, a part of that are those teachable moments. You know, so what are we going to learn by doing this piece? It's a wonderful piece of music. Everybody likes it, blah, blah, blah. But what concepts are in there that we can pull out and teach? When we pull them out and teach, the tendency is that they'll retain if we teach them appropriately. If they retain that knowledge, then they can apply it on the next piece. And so it gradually makes your rehearsal more efficient because the kids can make more decisions. You're not, if you find yourself as an educator like I did early in my career, having to go over the same thing all the time, the light bulb didn't go on that said, you know what, you're not teaching the concept right. All right, you need to make sure that you pull the concept out of the music, teach it, then apply it back to the music. And so I tell a majority of the kids in my groups are music educators. So I go through warm-ups with them all the time, which are warm-ups that they should be using. I think they should be using when they go out into the job. And so in piece X, if we've got a tricky little line that they've got some tricky little rhythms, the rhythm will be on the board and we will all execute it. The tuba players will execute, the bass clarinet players will execute it, because they need to know too. You know, if nothing else, they need to know what's going on while they're playing their parts. But I find all too often I'll get people that come in and they were very good on their instrument. They were very good at playing the music that was in front of them on their instrument, but they never were challenged beyond what the challenges of the music, what they were. And so by pulling that concept out, stretching it out, and giving it to everybody, then there's a better chance. Not only you can teach it, but you can teach for retention. The better they retain, the less you have to go over that in the future, the more music you can make and the more fun you have. At least that's my carrot for them. Look, you don't like me talking now, get this right, and I won't have to talk so much. You can figure it out on their own, because ultimately that's what you're doing, right? So.
Well, listen, as a tuba player, like that was the thing for me. Like most of my music, like I was looking at these. And it taught me from a relatively early age, if I can see through the note, I should be able to hear through the note. And so I spent a lot of time listening because I'm just back there hanging out. And instead of counting the number of light bulbs the maintenance people hadn't repaired in the band room, I was actually like, oh, yeah, that person does sound like they have a much cooler part than me, you know. So. We'll go over to Andy and then over to Jason. Other thoughts about linking that warm-up to the rehearsal objectives and things you're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I think that one of the things Tad was talking about in the last question with how we link with that pod, you know, the people on either side of us. A lot of times the thing that I'll say in regards to that is we want to try to disappear into those people. And especially when we talk about tuning, a lot of times with younger musicians, we get to that part where we've done the warm-up, everybody's doing really well, they've got everything here ready to go. We get to that tuning part, and all of a sudden everybody starts playing very loudly. And from their perspective, it's, I want to be able to hear myself. I want to be able to hear how I compare to everyone else. And a lot of times for me, the message becomes, disappear. If you're disappearing into the sound, then you're matching everything else that's going on in the room. You're playing at the same frequency, you're playing with the same level of intensity, you're blending with tone colors, so everything's cool. It's when you can hear yourself that something's different. You're playing at a different intensity, you're playing at a different frequency. So if you can disappear, then that brings everything in. So then when we get to the actual piece of music, and maybe there's this big section, the idea may be, okay, now the listening focus is your lead player. So get your ears over to that person. That person is going to set the bass dynamic, disappear into whatever that is, so that we could kind of connect those concepts from the beginning of rehearsal to what's happening a little later.
Yeah, cool. I like that.
Yeah, transference is so hard. I mean, because I noticed this with my studio bassoon students. Sometimes they'll be working on a piece, and they'll have just played like all of their scales in F major for the day, and they get to this one passage, and they keep cacking it up, and it's an F major scale that starts on the 4th degree, and then it ends up on the 3rd degree, and I'll say, well, what is that? And they said they have no idea. And I said, well, if you start here and you look down, what is that? Oh, and then they understand it. And I mean, it's some of it. I wonder, especially at the high school level, if it's all of this teaching to the test mentality. I think that's hard to, because that's what they're getting. I think in a lot of their other classes, it's all about teaching to the test. And I think when they get into our rehearsal room, better for worse, I think they carry that with them sometimes. So sometimes getting them to be able to transfer these skills, the skill set to different pieces, I think is, it can be tricky. And again, I think it's because of this high test mentality that they're just, okay, I have to do this task. And then, okay, once I've done that, now I'm going to go to this task. I'm going to use these skills to do this. And then that's it. And I mean, I see that with a lot of the college students too. I'll even have some conductors in my conducting class. We'll talk about terminology. We'll talk about certain things. And then I'll get into the rehearsal. I'll have some of the kids in the class and I'll say, okay, we just talked about this in class today. How would this work? How would you fix this? And they have no clue. They don't, they're as Tad's, their toolbox is empty. Or they misplaced the tool that I gave them, is what it is.
That's it. The hammer's broken. Yeah.
The hammer, right.
The hammer's broken, and this is a hex nut, and I've got a Phillips head. So,
right.
Gents, any final thoughts to share? Just about the warm up and about why it's important. And we'll round robin this. Give you each 20 seconds. No pressure, right? No pressure. We'll go Andy, and then Jason, then Tad.
Yeah, I think it's in some ways some of the most critical time that we have with our band. It's when you get all of the work of how you want to shape things done. So like if we're going to talk warm up, tune, and tone, the only two things that I want to throw into the mix without explanation, in the high school setting when I was doing that gig, I also always added technique and timing. So that technique, because most of my kids weren't taking private lessons, and if we wanted to do piece X, Y, and Z, we had to figure out where to get that technique somewhere. So there'd be technique exercises. And rhythm, I just kind of always found as the kryptonite to being a good reader. There would be a rhythm of the day or Garwood Whaley studies or something just to get us thinking that way.
Mm-hmm. Jason.
It sets the expectation, I think, for everything that we do in that time. And because we have our students for such a short time that, it really enables us to get on the same page, to be doing multi-directional listening, so that now we're listening in different dimensions, we're listening in different places. And I think it puts us in a different mindset. In some cases, you might even say it alters our consciousness a little bit to some degree.
Tad.
Yeah, I think I agree with I don't have a whole lot of thunder left. But I think what becomes evident is if anybody looks through the Ed List text, and there's early on in the book, he talks about he has a little graph there that shows attention and retention, like the optimal times for retention of information and where that is and how that graph goes up like this and then skyrockets to the basement. And and there's a lot of that I agree with, and it enforces the significance of that warm-up period so much in terms of what we choose to teach in it, because that's the time, I think, when we have the brain most locked in, we have the synapses being created, the dendrites firing. And so that's the time to teach them how to manipulate the music so that then in the music they can take this knowledge, this information, and then apply it. And like I said, everything that Jason and Andrew said, I wholeheartedly agree with. And I think that this time, nothing mundane. We have things that we'll do every day. We have to vary them, but we vary them with a purpose. And then we find concepts to teach them that they can then apply. They can use their own brain to apply and problem solve in the music.
Andy, Jason, Tad, thank you so much for being here today, for contributing. If any of you need to get in touch with them to ask them some deeper questions, you can get a hold of Andy at Westchester, Jason at IUP, and Tad at Westminster. I'm at Messiah, and we're here to lend a voice and hopefully provide some guidance for all of you directors who are tuning in. Thanks so much for joining me, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks, Travis.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Travis.